Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this program in the South Carolina Humanities Electoral Initiative. The mission of SC Humanities is to enrich the cultural and intellectual lives of all South Carolinians. This initiative began in October 2020 and has been offered by 4 South Carolina universities: Clemson, Francis Marion, the University of South Carolina, and Lander University. Today's session marks the 11th and final program in the series. You can watch all the programs of the Electoral Initiative at the SC Humanities website posted on your screen. This South Carolina Humanities Project is part of a national initiative entitled Why It Matters: Civic and Electoral Participation, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. The Why It Matters initiative provides free humanities programs to engage the public in collaborative, accessible, and thought-provoking dialogues on the importance of electoral and civic participation. Tonight's program is entitled, What is Needed to Keep a Democracy Healthy? Earlier programs have considered the outcome of the 2020 presidential and congressional elections and have analyzed the Electoral College, the role of social media, gerrymandering, voting rights, and more. But tonight we conclude by taking a step back and discussing a fundamental issue and an urgent one in our contemporary situation. How do a democratic people preserve, protect, and maintain a healthy democracy? As we come to the screen, let me make introductions. Hello, I'm Ashley Woodowis, Professor of Political Science and Chair of Lander's Department of Government, Criminology, and Sociology. Joining me is the distinguished scholar Stephen Levitsky. Dr. Stephen Levitsky is Professor of Government at Harvard University. The author of multiple works, Dr. Levitsky is an expert on authoritarianism, democratization, political parties, and political systems. He's a specialist in the area of Latin American politics. But what brings Steve Levitsky to us tonight, and what has garnered him a national audience, is his 2018 co-authored book, How Democracies Die. In the book, he and Harvard colleague Daniel Ziblatt make the case that the 2016 presidential election of Donald Trump signaled the arrival of a crisis of democracy for the U.S., but a crisis that in fact had been long in developing. How Democracies Die was a New York Times bestseller and named one of the best books of the year by the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and the Journal of Foreign Affairs. One reviewer commenting on the book said, "Reading Levitsky and Ziblatt will leave you very, very unsettled. They make a powerful case that we really and truly are in uncharted territory, living in a moment when the line between difficult times and dark times have blurred." Another reviewer put it succinctly, "If you want to understand what's happening in our country, the book you really need to read is How Democracies Die." So for the next hour or so, we're in for a rich and informative session on keeping democracies healthy. The first part of the session will focus on the book itself. We will then move in political time from the book's publication in 2018 to Election Day 2020. And our final section will consider the future of democracy and how we might keep that future democratic. At this point, I want to strongly encourage you to be an active part of tonight's session by using the Ask a Question button on the lower right of your screen. This allows you to post a question for Dr. Levitsky or to vote for a question from someone else that you would like him to address. Throughout this evening, I will combine my questions with yours so that together we might achieve an informative and perhaps even encouraging understanding of what our current democratic moment calls for from all of us. So let's have a great conversation. Professor Levitsky, welcome.
Thanks, it's great to be here. Keep flashing my book. It'll help pay for my daughter's education.
There you go. Vote early, vote often, right? So for me, the key moment in your text comes on page 91, when the two of you state this: "We cannot rely on constitutions alone to safeguard democracy against would-be authoritarians." You arrived at this conclusion on the basis of the research which the two of you had done. Why is the comparative approach that you used especially advantageous to understanding our U.S. situation?
Well, I think in the United States, we have had a single constitution since 1780s. So for more than 2 centuries, it's been a phenomenally stable constitution. It's been a phenomenally successful constitution. So Americans would be forgiven for kind of taking for granted that our constitution will work well. It's had a heck of a track record. And so Americans just sort of assume that what's written down on parchment will be effective in practice. And studying constitutions elsewhere in the world, some constitutions that are very similar to the U.S. Constitution. In fact, some constitutions that are ripoffs of the U.S. Constitution that are in parts plagiarized or that plagiarize the U.S. Constitution. We've seen that constitutions that are designed very well can sometimes function very badly in practice. That it's not just the written words that make a constitution work.
Can you give us some examples, both from your own research in Latin America and from Daniel's research in Europe, just this kind of the constitutional fragility that you referenced, and help us to understand? We've all grown up with American exceptionalism. It seems that one of the thrusts of your book is that, well, we're not exceptional yet in terms of our constitutional history.
Yeah, so maybe for me the starkest example of a constitutional failure is Argentina. In Argentina, the Argentines designed a constitution in 1853 that was pretty close to being an exact replica translated into Spanish of the U.S. Constitution. They could be, I think, accused in court of plagiarizing parts of the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution created a presidential system with a House of Representatives and a Senate and an Electoral College and a Supreme Court and a Supreme Court appointment process that was essentially a replica of the United States. And yet Argentina suffered 6 military coups in the 20th century, despite the fact that Argentina has the same rules for appointing Supreme Court justices, and that Supreme Court justices, when they're appointed, have lifetime tenure security. Every single president, both civilian and military, who came to power between, let me get this right, I think 1943 and the end of the 20th century, I think 2001, every single president packed the Supreme Court, either purged members of the Supreme Court and then or packed it. So judicial tenure security, which we take for granted, was completely absent in Argentina for almost the entire 20th century, despite the fact that their constitution said exactly the same thing as ours. I've forgotten the second part of the question.
That's fine. I was asking about a European example too, but we can leave that up. But I guess the question was, you and Daniel are comparativists, but you're writing an American book.
Oh, exceptionalism.
Yeah. So what's the advantage of using a comparative method to help our situation?
Look, the United States is distinctive in many ways. Its constitution is the oldest on earth, and I think you can make a case it's the most successful on earth. But exceptionalism, anybody who's trained in comparative politics knows that exceptionalism is good politics. It's a nice sounding discourse for somebody running for office, but it's completely meaningless from the standpoint of comparative politics. Anything can be compared. The United States, whether it is economic policy or levels of social inequality, or when we got the franchise, or how our presidential system works, or the strength of Congress, anything can be compared. And the United States is similar to many democracies in many, many ways. It's different from democracies in other ways, and it's changed over time. So the idea for one I think outright myth about American democracy is that it's much older than other democracies, that we're one of the early democracies in the world. The United States, by most comparative politics measures, didn't reach full democracy until the 1960s, when we when we guaranteed full suffrage to all of our citizens. So the U.S. is in some ways a more successful democracy than other democracies. In other ways, it is a markedly less successful democracy than others. But it's eminently comparable, and it's I think very dangerous for us, or at least risky, to not try to draw lessons from other comparable cases, whether they be in Europe or Latin America or elsewhere. Yeah, let me leave it at that.
Okay. One of the successes of our constitutional system you point to as two procedural principles: mutual toleration and institutional forbearance. So quite apart from the written text itself, these are the norms that the two of you really focus on as necessary for the success of our constitutional democracy. Can you talk about mutual toleration and institutional forbearance? What do you mean by those terms?
Sure. These are what we call democratic norms. They're unwritten rules that help to make our Constitution work well. Now, we have a very, very well designed Constitution. Our founders were incredibly informed, thoughtful, and far-sighted as far compared to other constitutional writers elsewhere in the world. But it's a Constitution that will work well under some circumstances and not so well under other circumstances. One of the reasons why it worked very, very well for a very long period of time was it was sustained by these informal norms. And so mutual toleration is pretty simple. It is a norm in which we accept the legitimacy of our rivals. We accept both in public and in private that our partisan rivals are not our enemies, that our partisan rivals are good citizens who love the country, who are patriots, and who have every right to be out there doing politics and opposing us and criticizing us. And if they beat us in an election, they have every right to govern us. We do not treat our rivals as enemies or existential threats. That's critical. Forbearance is a little bit more complicated. It is a deliberate willingness to forego using a legal right that's available to us. It is an act of deliberate self-restraint in the exercise of institutional power. Maybe it's best described by describing its absence. The absence of forbearance means using the letter of the law to undermine the spirit of the law. So forbearance means engaging in restraint in wielding institutions against rivals. And a couple of examples. Mm-hmm. The filibuster. The Senate filibuster has existed for more than a century. For most of U.S. history, the filibuster is a really powerful tool, right? It allows a minority, even a small minority in the Senate, to block all legislative activity. That's a very, very powerful weapon available to the minority. For most of U.S. history, the filibuster was rarely used. It was used between 1917 and I think the Kennedy administration, early 60s. It was used an average of one time per year. So senators have this really powerful weapon available to them. They didn't use it. They underutilized their power, which allowed our system to work. Another example, presidential reelection. Before 1951, there was no ban, no presidential term limits at all. Presidents could be president for life, just like Daniel Ortega is in Nicaragua today. But thanks to a precedent, an informal precedent set by George Washington, even the most powerful and most ambitious presidents, whether they be Jefferson, Grant, Andrew Jackson, none of them attempted to run for a third term. They deliberately underutilized their power. One more example, the pardon, the presidential pardon. Presidential pardon has always existed. It's always been in the Constitution, which means the president can pardon whomever the heck she wants, whenever she wants. That's a hell of a power to have, right? You could get your henchmen to commit all sorts of crimes and then pardon them all. You could arguably pardon yourself. Presidents historically have not done that. And it's this deliberate willingness to refrain from fully exercising one's institutional power that's critical to making any democracy or any constitutional system work. Without that restraint, we start to descend into institutional or constitutional warfare in which politicians are using institutions as weapons against the other guys, and democracy becomes dysfunctional, if not on a path to collapse.
Thank you. Your book is about what we might call the authoritarian temptation and how democracies, and specifically the US since 2016, democracies can travel an authoritarian pathway by democratic means. With the rise of Donald Trump and his continued popularity on the right, many commentators have expressed shock that so many Americans would support such an authoritarian figure. Yet you note throughout American history, Americans have long had an authoritarian streak where maybe 30 to 40% of the American people have been receptive to authoritarian messages and leaders. If that's the case, if we have this kind of substantial minority view, openness to authoritarianism, what makes our contemporary situation so problematic?
That's a great question. And we should keep in mind that, we like to think of ourselves as having been sort of an unbroken democracy for a couple of centuries. But remember that the US South was quite authoritarian, was essentially under single party rule for a good 80 years or so. So we have had authoritarian episodes with that were broadly supported by much of at least the white population in the U.S. South. Couple of things have changed. So one thing about that, if you say there depends how you measure it, but let's say there are about 30% of the population has authoritarian attitudes. That population in the past, for most of our history, has been evenly distributed between the two parties. That a minority of the Democratic Party and a minority of the Republican Party was authoritarian. But let's say it's 15% into each party. That wasn't enough to shape the direction of the party for two reasons. One, because 15% is not enough to be a majority of either the Democratic or Republican parties, but also because prior to 1972, the people didn't get to choose the candidates. It was the party leaders, party bosses, in what we think of as sort of smoke-filled back rooms, that selected the presidential candidates, and that's not very transparent. It's not very participatory. It's not very democratic. I'm not a huge fan of selecting candidates in smoke-filled back rooms, but that system of candidate selection, it didn't always produce the best candidates. It didn't always produce the best presidents, but it kept authoritarian demagogues from gaining the nomination. So just to give one example that we mentioned in the book, about 100 years ago, Henry Ford was a pretty popular outsider in parts of the country, particularly in rural parts of the country, in the Midwest. There were polls that showed him very, very popular and capable of winning the presidency. He never got particularly close to running, but he flirted with the idea of running for the Democratic Party nomination. Henry Ford was an extremist. He was potentially an undemocratic figure. It was very clear. The reason why he did not seriously pursue the presidency, or one reason, is it was very clear that politicians, that the Democratic Party leadership wasn't going to let him get anywhere near the nomination. Party leaders used to play a gatekeeping role that prevented demagogues, outsiders, from getting anywhere near the White House. So the roughly 30% with authoritarian attitudes was divided between the two parties, which diluted their impact, and they couldn't directly choose the candidate anyway. Two things have happened in the last 40 years. One, we adopted a primary system, which weakens the gatekeeping role, for better or worse. I would say for better and worse. That weakens the gatekeeping role of party leaders. So now the people, Democrats do have a say over who the Democratic candidate is, and Republicans do have a say over who the Republican candidate is. And the second thing, which is maybe a more controversial claim, but the data seems to bear this out, is that the folks with authoritarian attitudes have tended to migrate to the Republican Party in the last 30 or 40 years. By most measures, and these measures, people differ over the utility of these measures, but by most measures, that 30% is now concentrated primarily in the Republican Party. So that's now a lot of voters within the Republican Party, and they can choose a candidate. So this combination of a much more democratic process and the fact that more authoritarian-leaning voters are now concentrated in the Republican Party, that helped to give us Trump.
Great. We had some questions coming in. One is a theoretical question. Since the United States is one of the oldest democracies, what results do you think would happen in terms of the example that we can set about helping to institutionalize democracy around the world? If our constitutional system is so fragile and it seems to be wobbling, does this impact what we might call the future of democratic institutionalization around the world?
It does, although I think there are positive and negative scenarios. So the events of the last few years, Trump's election in the first place, some of Trump's behavior, but particularly, I would say, what happened on January 6, 2001, that was observed in everywhere in the world, and people received it with shock. So particularly since World War II, the United States had been a model for democratic aspirants throughout the world. Opposition figures, human rights activists in opposition to autocracies, whether it was Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union or China or parts of Africa, much of Latin America, the U.S. was the model. And that has really largely ceased to be the case. Very, very few Democrats, small d Democrats elsewhere in the world, look to the United States or point to the United States as a model anymore. In fact, to some degree, I don't want to overstate this, but to some degree, Trump was a model for autocrats. The use of calling the media the enemy of the people and denouncing every criticism of you as fake news. That was a really smart set of tactics that Trump came up with that was copied by populists and autocrats elsewhere in the world. People would close down newspapers and call it the enemy of the people and say, hey, the president of the United States said the same thing. So the U.S. has become, if anything, a negative example. Now, I don't think that's permanent. And I think I actually have a fair amount of hope that the U.S. can again be a model democracy. We're in this very, very difficult transition that really no democracy, at least to my knowledge, has ever quite undergone, which is a transition in which a previously dominant ethnic group loses its majority status. We are becoming a truly multiracial democracy in which no ethnic group has a majority and no ethnic group is dominant. That has never really existed in full force anywhere in the world. It's a really hard transition. It explains a lot of the really, really difficult polarized politics that we're going through right now. But I actually think the U.S. stands a pretty good chance of making it through that transition. We have a much longer history of dealing with large-scale immigration, with absorbing immigrants into our society. Much longer tradition of that than Western Europe, and we have a very, very well organized civil society pushing for civil rights. It goes back many decades. And if you look particularly at the younger generation, folks who are a bit younger than the two of us, attitudes towards racial tolerance and diversity are very different from our generation. They younger Americans in both parties are much more open to diversity, much more open to ideas of racial equality than any generation before. And so I think there's reason to think that in 20 or 30 years we're going to be we have a good chance of becoming the world's most successful multiracial democracy. And that can be a model to other diverse societies in the world, whether it's Brazil or Guatemala or Indonesia or India or other many other countries that are dealing with ethnic diversity, growing ethnic diversity, and long histories of ethnic oppression or inequality. I think the U.S. can be a model for making multiracial democracy work. We're not quite there yet, but I'm optimistic about it.
Well, your discussion about the changing demographic nature of America and having never seen a large democracy shift in terms of its majority status, a question came in about this very issue. And one way to think about the January 6th events is an expression of white grievance, that what Trump is tapping into is this loss of status among the white majority. How do you understand this issue of white grievance? Is there a way to think about it that doesn't seem to be so freighted with kind of highly charged negative connotations? And what do you think we can do to address this? I mean, if this is a real thing and if it's a challenging thing, how would you recommend we address it?
That's a toughie. If I had an answer to that, I think I would have a much better paying job. I do think that this issue of white identity, the salience of white political identities, perceptions of existential threat among some white voters, what is called, what I would certainly call rising white nationalism, and what some call white grievance. I think that's at the core of what divides us today, of what it has made our politics especially polarized and potentially prone to either democratic crisis or even violence. I think what has brought us to the brink is precisely this issue: the loss over the course of our lifetimes of dominant social status among whites in a context of growing two things: growing diversity and growing equality. And I do not have. I think I'm not optimistic that there's a single policy or strategy that we can very quickly come up with that will resolve that. I think we are in for a long, slow political struggle. I think there are a couple of things that we could ask our leaders to do. One of them is an ask of Republican leaders, which they don't, at least since Trump, they have not seemed willing to do, which is not go there, not play the white identity card, not gin up ethnic grievance. Ethnic grievance is a pretty combustible phenomenon, and it can be dampened, it can be exacerbated. And Donald Trump, what his particular innovation in American politics was to cross a line that no other major Republican was willing to do prior to 2016. Even the most conservative, far-right Republicans were not willing to cross certain lines in terms of openly white nationalist appeals. And Trump went there, and it worked, at least within the Republican primary. And he sort of opened a spigot that Republican leaders have been thus far unable and unwilling to turn back off. Turning it off, collectively coming together and saying, we're not going to engage in this kind of politics would make a difference. So far, that's a big ask of Republican leaders. I know that. But so far, they've mostly failed at that. The other thing we can do, which I think we're beginning to start to do under the Biden administration, is address issues of deepening inequality and declining social mobility. The bottom 40% in our society has not seen any income gains since the 1970s, whereas the top 20% has done spectacularly well since the 1970s. So we face levels of economic inequality that we have not seen since before the Great Depression, and we're seeing levels of social immobility. The fact that people's kids are, for the first time really ever in this country, growing up worse off than their parents, cannot aspire to a better life than their parents, probably can't even aspire to the same level of livelihood as their parents. That's a big deal, and that doesn't lower levels of inequality and higher levels of opportunity will not make white grievance go away. It won't make racial tensions disappear, but it'll help to combat them. It will help to calm the waters, maybe enough for us to get through this period of transition. So one thing the policymakers can do is work to create opportunities for all communities in this country. We've been since the 70s, and the Democratic Party has a lot of responsibility here. Since the 70s, 1980s, the Democrats stopped talking about issues of redistribution, particularly starting with the Clinton era in the late 80s, early 1990s, issues of using the government to combat some of the worst consequences of whether it's free trade or an open economy. That's been off the table. And we have let entire communities, entire swaths of territory, particularly in what we call red state America, really go to hell in the last 4 or 5 decades. And, the issues of inequality, issues of perceived economic injustice are deeply intertwined with perceptions of racial injustice. And so one thing we can do is take at least some steps to combating perceptions of economic injustice.
Thanks. Your book does, in fact, respond to the election of Donald Trump. And you said in the book there's several exit ramps that one takes to leave the Democratic road and to head towards authoritarianism. And that the election of Donald Trump in 2016 was one such exit ramp. Moving forward, as we need to do from 2016, 2017 into our own day, were other exit ramps taken? Were there other moments that really concerned you as we headed toward the election of 2020 that said, this was not just bad in 2016, it has gotten worse?
Yeah, unfortunately, things did get worse. The first exit ramp that we missed was in the nomination and election of Donald Trump. It was our opinion that it was very easy to identify, even before the election, that Donald Trump had authoritarian instincts, that this was not a figure who was committed to playing by democratic and constitutional rules of the game. You did not have to be a PhD in political science to recognize this back in 2015 and early 2016. So in our view, it was incumbent, it was crucial that Republican Party leaders realize that and either deny Trump the nomination, or if he were nominated through the primary process, that they publicly break with Trump and, if necessary, support Hillary Clinton. Because as much as you may disagree with or dislike Hillary Clinton, she was a small d Democrat and Donald Trump was not. So to defend democracy, Republican leaders had to, I know this is a big ask, had to support Hillary Clinton. They didn't do that. So that was the first exit ramp that we missed. The second one was using our constitutional checks and balances. So if Trump turned out to abuse power, we had the tools of congressional oversight and, if necessary, impeachment to stop him. And this is where partisan polarization basically left our institutions dysfunctional. When the Republicans controlled the House, the Devin Nunes-led oversight process didn't work at all. Trump did abuse power, did use the institutions of our government, use the power of the presidency to bully a foreign government to try to intervene against his rival in the 2020 election. This is one of the most egregious abuses of power that we've seen in any of our lifetimes, at least in the United States. And the Republican Party refused to check presidential abuse. Given the level of polarization in the United States, it became more important to beat the Democrats than to check executive abuse. And so Donald Trump was acquitted in the Senate. And we paid a price for that on January 6, 2001. We paid a price for not observing that this was an authoritarian that the Republicans had nominated, and for not using the constitutional powers available to the House and the Senate to constrain Trump. So the big difference that the reason why I think things were worse over the course of 2016 to 2021 than we anticipated when we wrote the book is that the Republican Party turned out to Trumpify a lot more quickly than we thought. When we wrote the book back in 2017, we expected that an important faction of the Republican Party, particularly in the Senate, would be able and willing to stand up to Trump, to draw certain lines and say, hey, you can't go past that line. And that the party itself would be able and willing to constrain Trump. And that turned out not to be the case. Very quickly, I mean, obviously, tragically, John McCain passed away, but anybody who stood up to Trump, whether it's Bob Corker or Jeff Flake, saw his political career ended. And by 2018, the party had completely Trumpified. There was no significant faction within the Republican Party able or willing to constrain Trump. And that process of Trumpification, which I would argue transformed the Republican Party into a party that was no longer committed to democracy. Seems a little extreme to say it, but basically transformed the Republican Party into an authoritarian party. That process was much more rapid, much more thoroughgoing than I expected 4 years ago. And this is exactly what we saw between November 2020 and January 2021. We saw an entire party, with a few very noble, brave exceptions, that was willing to accept and promote this big lie of a stolen election, eventually giving rise to a violent assault on the Capitol.
Does this explain the decision you all made in about 2 weeks before the election? You wrote a lengthy in-minority rule thought piece for the New York Times, and in it you called for the elimination of the filibuster. In the book, which I'm going to hold up again for everybody, in your book, you were very leery of abolishing the filibuster. You call that constitutional hardball. It seems, though, by the time we get to November 2020, you two were thinking it may be time for some constitutional hardball.
Yeah, I'm mixed about that. It depends on the type of constitutional hardball. Now, you're right that we have shifted, and I'll explain how. On the filibuster, I don't think I've shifted that much. The filibuster, as I noted earlier, when used with forbearance, is a completely acceptable institution. When the filibuster is something that you break the glass once or twice a year and you roll it out, fine. But we've gotten to the point, as we explain in the book, right, over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, where the filibuster is used in every single piece of legislation. The filibuster is the norm of forbearance with regard to the filibuster has evaporated. Right. It's non-existent. So the filibuster is a completely different institution than it was in the 1950s. It is a routine practice of obstruction. And I think that filibuster, without the norm of forbearance, has got to go.
Okay.
So it's not, there's no more forbearance to uphold with regard to the filibuster. In general, I'm still pretty leery of constitutional hardball. I'm not, for example, a proponent of Democrats packing the Supreme Court. But that said, so we were very, very aware of the use of constitutional hardball back in 2017 because we believed that that even though Donald Trump and some Republican leaders were beginning to violate democratic norms, there was a set of norms that still could be preserved. And I think over the last 3 or 4 years, first of all, those norms have basically been shattered. A very, very moderate Democratic senator told me a couple of years ago that he's convinced that we will never again see a successful Supreme Court nomination when a president doesn't control the Senate, when the president doesn't have a majority in the Senate. In other words, what happened with Merrick Garland in 2016 is about to become the rule, not the exception. These norms are just broken. And more importantly than that, the Republicans, unfortunately, as a Democratic political force right now, appear to be unsalvageable. Back when we wrote the book, again, we thought there was an important set of Republican politicians, of powerful Republican politicians, beginning with John McCain, obviously Mitt Romney, many others, who were fully committed to democratic rules of the game. There's still many, many, many Republicans who are fully committed to democratic rules of the game, but they've either been marginalized, sidelined, bullied into submission. Basically they're either pushed aside or cowed into submission. So they've been pushed aside, and unfortunately, I think the Republicans and the actions of November, December 2020, January 2021, I think made this manifest for everybody to see that this is a party that, if given the opportunity, could break our democracy. And so, that makes the case for, I don't know about hardball, maybe in a few cases constitutional hardball. I would take it issue by issue, but I think one arguable behavior, constitutional hardball, that I think I would support at this point is the offering of statehood to Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico to balance the Senate. That in an ideal world, I would not advocate a single party pushing that through, but I think it's critical to stave off what is essentially minority rule. In other instances, for example, court packing, I would not advocate constitutional hardball because it will accelerate the erosion of our norms. And so to the extent that we want to preserve our norms as opposed to accelerate their final destruction, I think even now, constitutional hardball has to be employed with a lot of restraint.
House just passed H.R. 1, Voting Rights Act. That has elicited a lot of calls to, this is the test for the filibuster. Get rid of it if the Republicans stand in the way. What's your view on this?
I think H.R. 1 is really important. Again, the one of the great dangers, this is what we argued in the op-ed a few months ago, that we're facing in the years to come is minority rule, because our institutions pretty heavily favor sparsely populated territories. And throughout our history, it's always been a problem for New York, and it's always been good for Vermont.
Right.
But it's never had a political impact. It's never had partisan consequences for 200 years because both parties had urban and rural wings. So it didn't matter, it washed out. Now, and this is not the Republicans' fault, but now our institutions, we for the first time, we have an urban-rural divide. So that we have one party that's based in the urban centers, the Democrats. We have another party that's based in sparsely populated territories, Republicans. Again, that's not the Republicans' fault, but that's the way things are shaken out. So that means that for the first time in our history, our institutions are biased towards one party. It means that the Republicans can control the Senate with 46, 47% of the vote. It means that Republicans can win the presidency with 47% of the vote. Had Joe Biden won the election, the popular vote, by 4%, as opposed to 4.5%, Donald Trump would be president today, despite getting pretty badly beaten in the popular vote. This is going to create real trouble for our democracy unless we take action. And one way to combat, I think the most democratic way to combat minority rule is to expand voting rights, to make it easier for Americans to vote. We would be a healthier democracy with 80% of American citizens voting as opposed to 55 or 60 or 62%. And so steps to expand both the make it easier to register and easier to vote, I think would be a healthy move. So I think HR 1 is critical. And if it takes ending the filibuster to do it, again, I think that's unlikely, but I think if it takes ending the filibuster to do it, it's critical.
Okay. Another example of institutional forbearance that you talk about in your book is executive orders, and you take the Obama administration to task for the kind of almost callous use of executive orders. With the Biden administration, we're on the threshold of maybe some legislative victories. If you were called into the Oval Office and asked about executive orders, kind of what advice, what is your feeling about executive orders with this new administration?
I am really torn. Look, we have a relatively weak presidency compared to other presidencies in the world. The U.S. Constitution does not give the executive a tremendous amount of power, certainly relative to other presidential democracies. And the presidency has strengthened in some ways, inevitably, over the course of the last 70 years. Major wars almost always strengthen the presidency. Security threats strengthen the presidency. And a lot of people worry about that to some degree. The strengthening since FDR probably is inevitable. But using skirting the Constitution, and whether it's executive orders or whether it's declarations of national emergencies like Trump, to skirt the legislative process is ultimately unhealthy for democracy. Right. The problem is our system was built with, first of all, it was designed with no parties in mind. The founders didn't know parties were coming. They didn't like parties. They didn't think highly of parties. They didn't expect parties. Parties came after the writing of the Constitution. But for most of our history, our parties, U.S. parties, were decentralized. They were pragmatic. They were highly heterogeneous, internally heterogeneous. You had New Deal liberals in the same party as Southern conservatives. You had Western conservative Republicans in the same party as liberal Republicans in New England. And so it was always easy for the president, even if the president didn't have a majority in Congress, to negotiate with Congress. Parties were not disciplined. People negotiated across the aisle all the time because the parties were not very ideological. They were very heterogeneous. They were very decentralized. All of that has changed. We've entered a totally new world since the late 20th century. The last 30 or 40 years, our parties have become ideologically coherent, cohesive, and disciplined. We have a liberal Democratic Party, a relatively liberal Democratic Party, and a pretty homogeneously conservative Republican Party. And they are very disciplined. And if you cross the aisle, you get hammered by constituents on your own side. I mean, any Republican who votes with the Democrats or who negotiates with the Democrats is going to have Sean Hannity down their back within minutes. And it's almost impossible to do. So we can no longer expect the parties to compromise. It just, in a highly polarized context, it won't happen. It doesn't happen. that if the other party controls a single branch of Congress, you can't get anything done. That compels presidents of both parties, whether it's Trump or Obama or Biden, it compels them to, if they want to get anything done, to kind of skirt the legislative process, use constitutional hardball, and use some sort of executive decree power. It's awful. It's unhealthy for our democracy, but I think it is inevitable as long as our parties are highly polarized. And so if I were an advisor to Biden, I would, particularly given what a serious crisis that we're facing with the pandemic, with the economy, with the possibility of an authoritarian Republican Party, I would, in good conscience, unfortunately, as much as I recognize and am pained by the negative consequences of using decree powers, I think he's got to do it.
Well, it brings us to our time capsule question. You and I spoke.
Oh, no.
You and I spoke just a couple of weeks after the election, and I asked you to put a question in the time capsule which would open up on March the 8th. And the question is, what's the thing we've got to be watching for? And you said, and I'm quoting Steve Levitsky here, what we have to look for will be the degree to which the Republican Party accords legitimacy and a minimum of respect to the Biden administration. Between November 17 and March 8, that's what we had to look for. So how's that going?
Could be worse. I think the leadership particularly in the Senate, I think Mitch McConnell sort of pivoted away from the worst kind of abyss by accepting the Biden administration's victory. But look, I mean, the behavior of the Republican Party is absolutely crucial for the future of our democracy. Our democracy depends on the Republican Party de-Trumpifying and becoming a mainstream center-right or conservative party. Every democracy needs a viable conservative party, and but not an extremist party. And under Trump's leadership, the Republican Party is an extremist party. And unfortunately, as we saw in the weeks following January 6th was a momentous opportunity for the Republican Party to break entirely with Trump and Trumpism, and a big ask, I recognize, but it was as good a possibility as anybody could imagine, an opportunity to make that break. It looks to me as if Mitch McConnell wanted to make that break, wanted to use that opportunity to make that break. Not only McConnell, but obviously Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, a number of important Republicans, but it didn't happen. It didn't work. I think most Republicans, your average Republican, took a few days, took the temperature of the Republican electorate, looked at polls, started listening to their constituencies, probably read a little too much Twitter, and decided that the base was still with Trump and that therefore they couldn't risk it. They couldn't risk breaking with Trump. So we still, on March 8th, still have a heavily Trumpified Republican Party. It's not a Republican Party that's, it could be worse. The party could be taking up armed resistance against Biden. It could be still insisting that Biden's not the legitimately elected president and leading protests to bring Trump back. It's not doing that. But Trump's still there. The Trumpist coalition is still solidly in control of the party. And so I worry.
So it sounds like you agree with your co-author when a week after the events of January the 6th, he gave an interview and he said, the central weakness of our political system right now is the Republican Party.
I always agree with my co-author. He's the smart one. All I did was come up with the title of the book. But yes, the Republican Party is right now pretty close to being an anti-system party. The great political scientist Juan Linz, who taught for many years at Yale, wrote a very, very influential book on the breakdown of democracy back in the late 1970s. And he basically laid out a series of things that mainstream political parties must do to preserve democracy. And the top of the list was unambiguously committing to winning power only by peaceful democratic means, to leaving power when you lose elections, and to always rejecting violent extremism, particularly on your own ideological flank. When mainstream political parties encounter extremism or violence or anti-democratic behavior on their ideological flank. In fact, Linz was thinking about leftists and guerrilla groups in Latin America in the 1970s, but the same goes for Proud Boys and Republicans today. Whenever a mainstream party confronts violent extremism or anti-democratic behavior on its own flank from its own ideological allies, Linz argued that it's critical that they break with them, and even if necessary, align with the other party to isolate those forces. And unfortunately, Kevin McCarthy and other Republican leaders have been unwilling and unable to break with them. The Republican Party has done more to isolate Liz Cheney than it has Marjorie Taylor Greene. And I think that tells you everything about where the Republican Party is today. Until the Republican Party is willing to embrace Liz Cheney and expel Marjorie Taylor Greene, as opposed to what is essentially vice versa, our democracy will be at risk.
One questioner wonders if the recovery of the Republican Party might be a recovery of their commitment to rule of law. That, we've always grown up with this view of the Republican Party being, committed to the rule of law, the court system. And they have, shall we say, waffled on that recently. Is that one way that you can see the Republican Party beginning to recover itself, saying, look, when the ballots are confirmed, that's it. The election counts. When the courts rule this way, that's it. The courts have spoken.
It certainly is. I mean, any small d Democratic Party must be committed to the rule of law, and I mean that's a sort of pretty minimalist thing. I think the Republicans will be, I forget the term that the questioner used, but that the recovery of the Republican Party will come about when the Republicans are comfortable winning national elections again, when Republicans can feel confident that they can win national majorities. And I think that will happen when it becomes basically a multi-ethnic party. They're not terribly far from it. It's easy to imagine a party that stands for conservative values, and that is conservative religious values that appeals to a fairly large number of African Americans and Latino voters. That's not that difficult to imagine, but obviously you got to drop the white nationalist shtick to do that.
Right. And
so far that hasn't happened. But that to me, that's the path to recovery. When the Republicans become a conservative party for all Americans, not just a conservative party for white Christian Americans, then they'll be able to win elections. They'll be able to win national majorities. And I think then that's when we can be comfortable that they are an established mainstream small d Democratic Party again.
So that leads in a positive direction. Another direction, someone wonders about a kind of the rise of regionalism as a kind of default site for governance in America, that what we might be heading towards, or what we could head towards, is a kind of consociation of regional governance sites.
Maybe. The reason why I'm skeptical of that, there are two reasons why I'm skeptical of that. First of all, so we've done that in the past. We were a much more decentralized, localized polity in the past, but our politics is really nationalized over the last 50 years. I mean, local media is not what it used to be. The old Tip O'Neill adage that all politics is local, that's actually not true anymore. It used to be true. He used to be right 50, 60 years ago. It's not true anymore. National politics weighs heavily in every district in the country. So the nationalization of our politics is one thing that militates against regionalism. The other one, though, is that the divide isn't really regional. The divide is urban-rural. So, I grew up in Ithaca, New York, which is a very left-wing university town, but it's in the middle of upstate New York. You drive. We were the last city in the United States, I think, competing even after Burlington, Vermont, to have a socialist mayor in Ithaca, New York. You drive 5 miles outside of town, and you're in Trump country. It's the same thing in the South. The South is very conservative, but if you go to the major cities in the South, they're pretty liberal. So within every red state, there are important blue pockets, and within every blue state, including California, New York, Massachusetts, where I live, there are important red pockets. And so it's much more urban-rural. We are red and blue are actually much closer together geographically than we think. They're not mixed. They're not integrated, unfortunately, but they're close. It's just urban-rural. So I don't think, I don't think South Carolina or New York can ever be part of a truly blue or red region because of the diversity within the states.
Yeah, sure. So you have an interesting phrase that you borrowed from Daniel Patrick Moynihan about defining deviancy down. And you said that under President Trump, America has been defining deviancy down. First of all, can you explain how this has happened and what this is? And can a democracy, once it's defined deviancy down, can a democracy elevate the definition of deviancy? Can we recover once that box has been opened up?
I think so. So look, by defining deviancy down, we meant that there were certain things that in the United States and American politics you just didn't say and you didn't do in the past, right? Now this wasn't always true. There were periods, very, very rough periods of American politics, 1790s, 1840s, and 1850s. There were the historian Joan Friedman documents more than 100 cases of violence within the U.S. Congress in the run-up to the Civil War. So it's not true that our politicians engaged in gentlemanly behavior throughout our history. We've gone back and forth. McCarthyism is another period where you had politicians, particularly McCarthy and his allies, saying and doing things that were that previously and posterior were not acceptable. Periods of red baiting. But Trump did that, certainly engaged in behavior, crossed behavioral lines, insulting people, making fun of people, degrading people in his language, that I never saw in my lifetime in American politics, and that many of us, I think, never thought imaginable. And he made it possible to engage in this sort. He lowered the cost for other politicians of doing similar behavior, whether it's political candidates giving body slams to reporters in Montana, to Marjorie Taylor Greene insulting the congresswoman in the office across the hall, to what may have been, I think we're still learning, complicity with acts that may have put the lives of other congresspeople at risk on January 6th. So politicians now have room to maneuver. They can say things and do things that would have been political suicide when you and I were growing up in the latter decades of the 20th century, and that's dangerous for democracy. And you see in Spain in the 30s, you see in Chile in the 70s. I don't want to get too extreme, but this expansion of the realm of what is acceptable political behavior, to insulting the media or insulting rivals, threatening rivals, to maybe even tolerating violence or violence threats against rivals. That is I don't want to say it's a slippery slope, but expanding that realm gets you pretty quickly into dangerous territory. Now, I think we can walk back from that. We walked back from McCarthyism. Unfortunately, it took the Civil War before, and a couple of decades after the Civil War, before we regained a degree of civility in our politics in the past. But the thing is that politicians have to decide that there's no benefit to engaging in that kind of behavior. And right now, unfortunately, there's a pretty big constituency for norm violating, aggressive, even violent sounding behavior in the Republican camp. I hope this has not emerged, hasn't really yet emerged on the left. But politicians have to decide it's not worth it. Now, having Biden in the presidency, Biden is, for all of his limitations and faults, he's somebody who takes very seriously the norms of democratic politics and is, I think, hopefully beginning to, will at least try to rewrite the norms of presidential behavior. I don't think he can put it all back in the box. It's going to take years and even decades probably to unlearn some of the behaviors, the acceptable behaviors that Trump and his hench people brought upon us. But it's a step in the right direction.
When you talk about the condition of the Republican Party and it being perhaps the major issue, I mean, you can't talk about the emergence of the Republican Party without also bringing in the whole issue of social media and communication technologies, which is yet a different kind of threat, I think, to democracy, because social media can really serve to weaponize language to undermine democracy. So can you reflect on this kind of other kind of threat to democracy, the whole realm of social media?
Yeah, I don't. This is not something I'm expert in. I don't have a lot of insight that probably everyone in the audience has already heard. There is pretty credible research in the last 5-6 years, 10 years maybe, that shows that social media does seem to have a polarizing effect. It does. We're now able to sometimes consciously, sometimes not consciously, choose our own media and our own social media communities so that we enter into echo chambers. And within those echo chambers, we do over time unconsciously tend to gravitate towards the more extreme positions. And there's now an incentive in social media to use incendiary language. I was just noticing today, my day job is a scholar of Latin America, and watching in Peru how opponents of the government are using the term genocide to describe a very centrist, pragmatic government's stumbles in terms of vaccine rollout. So the Peruvian government not handling the pandemic terribly well is getting accused of genocide on Twitter because that's a Twitter handle that will go viral, right? So politicians, activists have an incentive to use the most extreme language. Call everybody a fascist. Call everybody a Nazi. Call everybody racist. Call everybody committing genocide. It's social media creates incentives to use that language, so it's rough. And so it is reinforcing polarization. The two caveats that I always add to try to land in a more optimistic place is, one, we have worried about new technologies, new media technologies in the past. We were very worried in the 1930s that radio was going to contribute to fascism. We were worried with the rise of television that television was going to give rise to demagoguery. Maybe it has. But societies, governments, politicians, citizens eventually adapted to these new media technologies, eventually learned how to to regulate them and make them more or less workable in a democratic society. I think we are going to have to regulate social media. Social media is going to have to learn how to regulate itself. Politicians and social media are going to have to come up with a whole set of both rules and norms and practices that are acceptable. There's no guarantee that we'll get there, but I think looking back at history, there's at least some precedent. There's some chance that we'll get there. I think it takes politicians, governments, citizens, researchers. We always run behind the development of technology. It takes us a while to learn about their consequences and to learn how to regulate them in a democratic society. And I think there's at least some chance that we'll do so. And we have to remember that although social media does exacerbate polarization, it's not the cause. Societies, we fell into civil war in the early 1860s, 1850s, 1860s, without Twitter. Right. Hard as it is to imagine. The Spanish Civil War, Spain ripped itself apart for almost a decade, without Facebook, amazingly. And Chile fell into regime-threatening polarization in the 1970s and military dictatorship without a single person being on Instagram or YouTube. So you don't need social media to kill a democracy, and you don't need social media to descend into civil war. And so I think, although it's very real, the consequences of social media are very real. I think we need to focus our attention, at least not get distracted from the underlying causes of polarization.
Which led one student to wonder in a question, it seems like obviously to limit the reach of polarization is necessary to kind of recover and rebuild democracy, to limit its reach and its impact. But the student wonders, and perhaps social media contributes to this way of thinking, is it too far gone? I mean, can we walk back from, because polarization works. I mean, it works in the short-term self-interest of politicians. It works for the short-term self-interest of media. Polarization works. We find our tribes. We nestle into our tribes. We buy the swag for our tribes. We watch the shows for our tribes. It seems to be to kind of settle into kind of concrete realities. It seems to me you're suggesting it can be that way, but perhaps it's not inevitable that it goes there.
No, there's so many other factors that shape politics. And for example, one reason why we nestle so easily into tribes and spend so much time hacking at our fellow citizens is we don't have an external threat, an external existential threat. I am not advocating or wishing for a war, but if we were ever in a situation like we were during World War I or World War II or during the Cold War, where we have a serious existential external threat, we would forget about fighting I guarantee you, we would forget about our fights over Dr. Seuss and mask wearing and the like. So the geopolitical context and the degree of military threat that we face matters a lot. Sometimes domestic crises, the Great Depression, I had thought that maybe the pandemic would help us overcome some of our polarization. That didn't happen, obviously, but there are a lot of events both within the country and in the world that can very quickly change the parameters of politics. The other thing that can happen, and I really hope this does not happen, is sometimes polarization pushes democracies into the abyss. So sometimes you get the Civil War and the rise of Franco in Spain. Sometimes you get a descent into military dictatorship under Pinochet in Chile. Sometimes you descend into civil war like the United States. I hope to God that does not happen here, but sometimes the costs of polarization lead societies, lead activists, lead politicians to realize that we have to find another way of doing politics. So it would be very, very short-sighted to think, well, we've sort of lacked polarization works. Social media is here to stay, so we're sort of condemned to this towards infinity. Yeah, it's these things are probably with us for the years to come, but in the medium run, there are many, many things, both positive and negative, that can shake our society out of it and put us on a different track.
Well, I would be remiss not to ask this question with so many students listening and watching tonight. But in terms of a practical takeaway for them, what are things that, with your students, what are you telling your students? This is what you can do to help, get us out of this crisis.
That's a great question. I guess I would say three things. One, it's really important in this polarized setting. This is advice I give to my students at Harvard, which may be somewhat different from students in South Carolina, which is that it's really, really important to continue to expose themselves to different viewpoints, to not only expose themselves to, in the case of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Harvard, we're talking about a heavy concentration of progressives who don't encounter many conservatives in their day-to-day lives. It's not true of everybody, but of a lot of them. And so it's really important that they get exposed to conservative views and conservative people, and that they, for older people who grew up in a more politically mixed environment, it's not that difficult to be able to have a conversation with someone from another political viewpoint. But kids growing up today, 19-year-olds today, who've grown up in this intensely polarized environment, don't necessarily have the basic skills of being friends with someone from another political party and being able to have a civilized conversation with someone from very different political perspectives. So making sure it in the 1950s or 60s or 70s, and there are still parts of the country where this is true, you could take for granted that you were going to grow up in a pluralist environment. You could take for granted that you were going to learn these skills. That's not true anymore. It's actually work. We have to go out and put ourselves in situations where we have to be tolerant of people of different political views. That's one. The other thing is, I think we should all work to never reward politicians who engage in abusive behavior. Any politician from any party who engages in egregious constitutional hardball or reproduces a big lie of a stolen election, or engages in language that is either insulting of the other side or perhaps even condones violence, we should never, ever, ever reward those politicians, no matter what party they're from, no matter what their political or ideological position. We as citizens should always, always work to punish democratically politicians who engage in behavior that doesn't strengthen our democracy. And the third thing, and this may seem a little more partisan, but I think it's very, very important at this point in time that we push democratic reforms, and that we, most importantly, defend and ideally expand the right to vote. Make it easier for Americans to access the ballot. And if that means a comprehensive reform where Republicans, in exchange for tolerating, supporting an extension of suffrage, get something like a national voting ID card, I'm in favor of it. There are all sorts of compromises. This doesn't have to be a Democratic Party agenda, but we are right now at a point where politicians are tempted to restrict voting access, to pass laws and adopt policies that make it harder for Americans to vote. That is not a place that we as a society, as a democracy, want to be. And so if there's a cause, if you're looking for a political cause, the cause of fixing our voting and expanding the right of all Americans to to vote and making it easier for Americans to vote, I think is a really, really important cause.
Great. Steve, we're going to be kind of circling for a landing here. So I want to ask you one last question.
Sure.
This past November, I asked you to peer into your crystal ball, and with Cassandra-like accuracy, you gave us the word. So now I'm going to ask you to peer again into that crystal ball. Looking forward, near term, long term, the prospects for democracy. Is the glass half empty or is the glass half full?
Well, we political scientists are terrible, awful at predicting the future. I'm gonna take a slightly different crack at that, which is to say both, but to say that I think in the short to medium run, I think we're headed for some difficult times. I think that the chances of sort of sliding in and out of constitutional crisis, the risk of a very, very crisis-ridden election in 2024, the risk of some level of violence, I think is pretty high. I think we're staring at a difficult next 5 or 10 years. So I'm very worried. You could say I see a glass half empty in the next 5 or 10 years. I'm pretty optimistic about the longer term future. Like I mentioned earlier, I think if you look to when you guys, the students today, are running the country in 20 or 30 years, I think there's a good chance that we're in an earthquake right now, but I think we're going to pass out of it, and I think we will end up on the other side with I think we stand a good chance at emerging on the other side with a fairly robust multiracial democracy. I think that's where we're heading, and so I think that in the longer term, it's hard to put a date on it, but in the longer term, I think the glass is half full.
And if we achieve that multiracial, multi-ethnic, egalitarian society, we'll be exceptional indeed.
Yes, I think I wrote that somewhere.
In fact, you did. So as we come to a conclusion for this evening, I'd like to just pass out a couple of thanks to Courtney Myers, who provided technical assistance for us. Special thanks go out to Dr. Alice Taylor Colbert, who has served as the project director for the South Carolina Humanities Electoral Initiative. If you want to read more about the issue of democratic resiliency, the topics that we've talked about tonight, please take a look at the suggested readings offered for tonight's program, found on either the SC Humanities webpage or on the Lander University webpage. And before you go, right at the very bottom of your chat is going to be a survey. It would be a great help if you would please fill out that brief survey. Great help for our future programming. So Steve Levitsky of Harvard, thank you again for taking this time to be with us. We really appreciate it.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
As the authors of How Democracies Die state in their conclusion, American democracy depends on us, the citizens of the United States. It's a shared enterprise and its fate depends on all of us. It seems fitting that we end this session with the words from famed American journalist Edward R. Murrow, who in his generation fought the good democratic fight against McCarthyism. In Murrow's well-known and oft-used conclusion to his program, so we end ours with good night and good luck. Thanks, Steve.